Hey everybody, welcome to Crazy Tech Lab, and I've got a great video for you today because I am going to be pitching a whole bunch of M.2 SSD heatsinks against the daddy out there at the moment. This is the Crucial T700 Pro. It's PCI Express 5 M.2 SSD and it has a read speed of over 12,000 megabytes a second. The downside though is that it runs pretty hot, and as you might have seen in the news recently, there are lots of very large heatsinks coming with these SSDs. But this one, or this model of the T700, doesn't come with a heatsink. You can get one with a heatsink, but this one comes without one. So you can, in theory, use your motherboard's heatsinks or one of the third-party heatsinks that we've got here, or some others out there as well. Now, we're going to be pitching all of these heatsinks today against the Crucial T700 Pro, which is PCI Express 5, but if you're not in the market for a PCI Express 5 SSD and you want to call a PCI Express 4 SSD that's a bit more reasonably priced, then we'll be testing all of these heatsinks against an older PCI Express 4 SSD as well. So things have moved on quite a bit from my last M.2 SSD heatsink group test. Heatsinks today aren't just a luxury or an aesthetic item, they are absolutely essential for keeping your PCI Express SSD cool. So today we'll be running all of these heatsinks in a new test system that I built, and we've got some crazy stuff here as well. We've got massive heatsinks, we've got a water block that actually sits on your M.2 SSD, as well as some fan assisted ones as well. So lots of exciting little products to look through today at a range of price points, and you can also see links to all of the products down below in the description. So don't forget to do that if you want to show your support to the channel. I do make a little bit of a cut from those links, so don't forget to use them if you want to buy any of the heatsinks featured in today's video, or any of the hardware that I've used as well. First though, a word from our sponsor. Our sponsor today is scdkey.com, where right now you can get great deals on software such as Windows 10, Windows 11 and Microsoft Office. And even better is I've got a 25% discount code to share with you guys. Windows 10 Professional, for example, which is fully upgradable for free to Windows 11. All you have to do is click Buy Now, enter the code CRT25 into the promotion code box, click Apply, and the US price will drop from $22.09 down to just $16.57, and in the UK, you'll see the price fall to just £12.79. Once you've paid, head over to your order page, click the Get Key button, and copy your Windows key code. When you're in Windows, you want to move your mouse over to the Start button, right-click, go to Settings, then Update and Security, and then move up to Activation, and finally click on Change Your Product Key, copy and paste your brand new product key into the box, click Next, then click Activate, and your Windows 10 installation is now activated. You can do the exact same thing with Office 2021 Professional, CRT 25, click Apply, and you will see a hefty discount. Thanks again to SCDKey for sponsoring today's video. So first up, I wanted to talk about my testing methodology here today, and we're going to be using an Asus ROG Strix X670E gaming Wi-Fi motherboard, because it's got some pretty decent heatsinks on there and plenty of PCI Express 5 M.2 ports as well. So we're going to be putting those heatsinks to the test to see whether or not you need any of these heatsinks, or whether or not the motherboard heatsinks can actually do the job and do what they say in terms of cooling a super toasty PCI Express 5 SSD. As I mentioned, we're going to be using the Crucial T700 Pro PCI Express 5 SSD for the testing, but we're also going to be using a WD SN850 PCI Express 4 SSD as well, because I know that those things are super good value at the moment. There's lots of great deals on that stuff, and they still run pretty hot though. You still want to make sure that you're cooling it effectively, so we're going to be pitching all of these heatsinks against that SSD as well. Now, my test system includes a real-world PC in terms of using a case. I'm not going to use one of my water-cooled test systems for the simple reason they don't really have any fans on there apart from radiators, and that means that there's not going to be much airflow going over the motherboard, and that will be happening in a case, and that has a massive impact on cooling a lot of these SSDs. The residual airflow just flowing over the motherboard, cooling the heatsink. So what I've done is built a water-cooled PC inside a Cooler Master Masterbox TD500 Mesh V2 case, which looks absolutely fantastic. You can see a link to that PC and all the hardware that I've used inside in the description below. And we're going to be using that case because it's got really good airflow. It's got 3 front intake fans. They're RGB as well, so they look absolutely awesome. And they just provide a bit of airflow going over the motherboard. So we'll be using that PC to test all the heatsinks today. That's pretty much it from this part of the video. So let's crack on with the results. But first of all, we're going to go through each heatsink in turn to see just how easy they are to install and talk about the pricing as well. So installation, obviously very important because you don't want it to be too tricky. You don't want to put too much force onto your delicate M.2 SSD either. So we'll be doing that first, going through the results and then coming to some conclusions at the end.
So we've got a very, very large heatsink here, and as you can probably tell by the ROG logo on the side, this is a heatsink from Asus. But it is not one that you can actually buy because this is specifically made for the ROG Strix X670E gaming Wi-Fi, and this heatsink is bundled in the box with that motherboard. Now, out of the box, it comes with a much smaller heatsink cooling the lower two M.2 ports, both of which are PCI Express 5 compatible. But this heatsink is bundled in the box to deal with PCI Express 5 SSDs and is about 2 or 3 times thicker than the stock heatsink. So what we're going to be doing is strapping this to the bottom 2 ports and seeing if it can handle our Crucial T700 Pro. We've got another fan assisted heatsink here, and this time it is the ASRock Blazing M.2. Now, this heatsink, along with a silver version, were actually sent to me a long time ago. I think it was back last year in 2022, around the launch of Socket AM5, when ASRock sent me some motherboard samples to test, and they shipped these heatsinks as well, presumably because they knew that PCI Express was just around, Express 5 SSDs were just around the corner, and they wanted to make sure that their motherboards could cool them properly. So they sent these heatsinks, but obviously the actual SSDs didn't arrive for a long time after. Now, despite them sending these SSDs to me last year, they've only recently just announced them. So I believe it was back in March or April, they announced a whole range of Blazing M.2 heatsinks. Now, the only downside with these is, as you can see, they are only designed to fit on ASRock motherboards, and ASRock has a compatibility table on its website for these things. Now, that's a bit of a shame because it looks pretty good. It's got lots of surface area. It's got a fairly chunky fan, if albeit a small fan, but it is PWM controlled, so you won't need to run it at full speed. You can tune it down to inaudible levels. In terms of mounting it on the motherboard, it is specific to the motherboard and the distance between the M.2 mounting holes, and I've just tried to install this heatsink on the Asus board that I'm using for testing today, and it doesn't fit, which is a bit of a shame. So what we need to do here is actually mount it on this motherboard, and it only goes that way around. So basically the airflow pointer is drawing down from above and then onto the heatsink below. And what we'll do is just whip out the Asus motherboard once we're finished testing, and we'll get some numbers for this thing just to see how it performs. So if you do have an ASRock motherboard and you want to use one of these things, then at least you'll be able to see how well it cools a PCI Express 5 SSD. So the next heatsink that we're going to be testing is the Icy Box heat pipe heatsink, and this one is the first fan assisted one that we're going to be testing, and as you can see, it comes with a 4-pin PWM connector there and a small fan in the heatsink. You get direct contact heat pipes, 2 of them in the heatsink array. It's pretty tall. So one thing the M.2 water block from Corsair does have is that it is fairly short, but then of course you've got to worry about tubing and that kind of stuff sticking out as well. So this one is one of the larger heatsinks on test, and we're going to see how it performs and how you install it. So to install it, basically you've got a bracket that I will just get over here and put your SSD into there. First of all, putting one of these thermal pads on, and then another thermal pad on the underside of the actual heatsink. Combine the two and away you go. So next up we have the Be Quiet MC1 Pro, which is a pretty simple heatsink, but the top section is pretty chunky. So you've got a large section of aluminium here, and you also, if I just peel away the thermal pad protector there, you do have heat pipes in here as well. So a little bit more going on under the hood than first appears, and installation is really easy. You just need to put the SSD in like so, and then you place the larger heatsink on top. And as you can see here, you have the sliders for different thicknesses of SSDs, and on this SSD, on this heatsink rather, they are actually labeled so you know which one it should be. And of course we've got the Crucial T700 Pro SSD in here, so it's double-sided, and as you can see, that lines up perfectly there. And to connect everything together, you've got a screwdriver and the 4 screws to install the top side of the heatsink to the bottom one and secure your SSD. So pretty simple, and hopefully it's going to be effective as well. Next up, we have the Thermalright HR-09 2280 Pro, and this is an absolutely enormous heatsink. I think it's definitely the tallest one here, and typical Thermalright quality. It feels really, really well made, cools both sides of the SSD, and is pretty easy to install as well. Similar mounting mechanism to the other SSD heatsinks. You just kind of put both sides together and put some screws through the sides. So we've obviously got one large heat pipe that goes all the way through, and actually no, my mistake, 2 heat pipes that go all the way through. They're pretty chunky as well, so hoping for good things for this one. The only downside I can see is that if your SSD is installed like this in the case, and you've got airflow coming through the case this way, the fins are kind of mounted the wrong way around to make any use of that airflow, which is a bit of a shame. So it's a big heatsink, but the fins aren't aligned with your typical case airflow, which is a bit of a shame. A slightly cheaper option from Thermalright this time, just called the M.2 2280 heatsink, and it's a pretty nifty looking heatsink, very smart, looks pretty easy to install as well, just securing the 2 screws either side of the SSD. It cools both sides with thermal pads. The only downside is that, again, we're dealing with quite a limited surface area here. Even if there's quite a bit of metal involved, it's quite a hefty heatsink, but there's not a lot of surface area on this thing. So however, we should be able to get some airflow across the top of the heatsink there, which we couldn't do with its larger sibling with all its fins. But I'm suspecting that it's going to be a tough job for this heatsink to deal with our PCI Express 5 SSD. Okay, so we have another simple heatsink coming up now, which is the Sabrent Rocket NVMe heatsink, which I believe is also bundled with some of its own M.2 SSDs. Now we have 3 heat pipes here, and a fairly large heatsink, so it's a lot chunkier than the Be Quiet that we were looking at a minute ago. However, the heatsink doesn't seem to be quite as the surface area, I think, is probably a little bit better on the Be Quiet heatsink here. We've just got a lot of metal, but not a great load of surface area. But we do have the heat pipes, which might, an extra heat pipe, because I think the Be Quiet had 2. So yeah, pretty nifty looking heatsink though. It's quite attractive. Very, very easy to install your SSD as well. So put your SSD down there, having removed the protective film, and add the second thermal pad if your heatsink is single-sided. Ours is double-sided, so we don't need that one. And then you just put that on there, connect the 4 screws. You even get a screwdriver in the box as well, and away you go. So very, very easy to install. Pretty large, quite wide as well by the looks of things. So we'll be interesting to see if this impacts on our graphics card as well, the backplate on the graphics card. But pretty simple, looks funky, and remains to be seen what it's going to be doing in terms of cooling. Next up, we have the Johnsbo M.2 ARGB, and as its name suggests, it does have RGB lighting. So there are no fans on here, just an LED lighting strip, RGB lighting strip underneath this kind of opaque diffusing housing on the top. And not entirely sure about the mounting mechanism on this one. You just get a double-sided thermal pad. There's no cooling for the underside of the SSD, which could be a problem. But the Asus motherboard that we have does actually include underside board cooling, although I have removed that for now because most of the SSDs have actually got cooling, or the heatsink, should I say, have got actually underside cooling anyway. So this one doesn't, so I'm tempted to try it without any underside cooling, just leaving the motherboard as it is. Also just seeing how this thing actually stays on, because I've lifted the edge of the thermal pad and it doesn't feel like it's particularly sticky. So I thought it was just like a thermal adhesive pad, but it just kind of seems to be a standard thermal pad. So not the most secure arrangement. It does come with a screw, but it only secures from one side. So I'm going to see how we get on with this one and what the cooling results are like. We have another RGB heatsink here then in the form of the J&D Tech TR M.2 2280 ARGB. So the lighting comes down the side channels here, and thankfully, unlike the Johnsbo SSD, we do have a better mounting mechanism here. So we've got cooling on both sides courtesy of these thermal pads, and we have a base plate, and everything kind of slots together like so. And that's pretty much how we go. Now, I'm not sure why it's got this cover on here, because you're not really going to see that because it's sitting at the bottom, but I'm guessing it's probably for just preventing short circuits and that kind of stuff, and it will protect this outer layer from scratches too, but I'm guessing it's mainly for short circuiting reasons. So not a massive heatsink though, and the surface area is pretty poor, so I'm not expecting this to do well with our PCI Express 5 SSD. Next up we have another passive heatsink, and this one is the Quivinsry HT001, and it's a pretty affordable heatsink and a lovely big surface area there as well, so that should hopefully help dissipating the heat, and it also aligns with the airflow in our case, which is front to back. You get double-sided cooling as well, with 2 thermal pads included to cool both sides of the SSD, along with a slightly larger one to deal with M.2 SSDs that don't have double-sided components. Somewhat unnecessary number of screws. You have 3 on each side. It looks like it's more of an aesthetic reason for doing that. You could quite easily just get away with 2 on each side, I think. But pretty compact, very low profile, not too wide. So let's see how it does. So here we have the Corsair XM2, which is the only M.2 water block on test. It's not really a heatsink. Obviously, you're going to get pretty good results from this because that copper base plate down there just has coolant running straight over it. You've got G1/4 inch ports that are compatible with pretty much any fittings out there. Only water cools the top side of your SSD. The bottom side is cooled with a passive base plate, and you get 2 sets of thermal pads there to cater for single-sided and double-sided SSDs. The only downside is that it can be tricky to install. There are no screws here, and it's kind of like just Corsair cheaped out a bit with the design and mounting with this thing, because it can be very, very difficult to get the metal flanges on the bottom section to clip into the slots on the side. Apart from that, it's pretty good. It's pretty easy to install. It's very secure, but you might need to grab some pliers and a flat blade screwdriver just to kind of push those metal clips into place.
Looking at the thermal results now then, and first up is the PCI Express 5 results with the Crucial T700 Pro's PCI Express 5 SSD. And with this thing chugging along at over 12,000 megabytes a second, the best result was from the Corsair XM2 water block, which managed a peak temperature of 51 degrees C in our stress test. So that's miles away, nearly 30 degrees away from the throttling temperature. So obviously you'll need a custom liquid cooling setup to get the very best temperatures out there, but if you do, it's well worth investing in this water block. Next up is the ASRock Blazing M.2. Kind of a shame that this thing isn't available yet, and that it's only apparently going to be compatible with ASRock motherboards. But if you do have a motherboard and you want to wait for this thing to come out, then you'll get the second best result on test of 59 degrees C, so a good well over 20 degrees away from the SSD throttling temperature. Next up though is the Icy Box fan-assisted SSD heatsink, and this one was only just behind the ASRock. Very, very good result, easy to install, compatible with pretty much any M.2 slot, and I had no issues with the tool-free fittings on my Asus motherboard or with the large backplate on my Palette graphics card. Next up though, the pretty impressive results from the Asus motherboard, the ROG Strix X670 gaming Wi-Fi. So great result here from the Asus motherboard and its own PCI Express 5 heatsink. So really, you don't need to buy a third-party heatsink if you've got this motherboard. I can't comment on other motherboards. I know that the heatsinks vary wildly out there in terms of what's available, but if you've got the ROG Strix X670 gaming Wi-Fi, then all of the heatsinks on the motherboard that are designed for PCI Express 5 SSDs should do the job. So well done, Asus. Next up, we've got the Icy Box heatsink again, but at half speed here. So if at full speed it's noisy, you probably won't want to have it at full speed unless you're absolutely hammering the SSD at regular intervals. Half speed though, you're only adding 6 degrees C to the temperature, and the thing is pretty much silent above or below the rest of the system. And it was a relatively quiet system as well because it was water cooled. So and that's still beating more than half of the other SSDs in the on test, and it's still a good 14-15 degrees C away from throttling the SSD. Next up, we've got the ASRock Blazing again, and with this one at half speed, it was about the same as the Icy Box. The last SSD I consider being capable of coping with the Crucial PCI Express 5 SSD is the Thermalright HR-09 Pro. That managed 68 degrees C, which is a good 12-13 degrees lower than its throttling temperature. And as I say, it's the last SSD in this test that I would consider buying for the Crucial SSD, with all the other results in red, and that's simply because they're just too close to the throttling temperature that I would feel comfortable using with them. The Sabrent Rocket maybe just scrapes in, but with its compatibility issues with a lot of the tool-free fittings on a lot of modern motherboards, which PCI Express 5 supporting motherboards will be amongst those. Most motherboards that I've seen do include those kind of tool-free fittings now. It's just not going to fit into those motherboards, so that's why that's one of the reasons why that one's in red. But again, it's only 6 or 7 degrees away from throttling, so if your case is a bit toasty or it's a warm day out there, then you could well see the temperature rising up to thermally throttling levels. One other result I'm going to mention here is the Crucial T700 Pro stock heatsink. This thing was not able to keep it away from the throttling zone of 81 degrees C. It pretty much reached that, so I would definitely go for the heatsink-less version and either use your motherboard's heatsinks or get one of the heatsinks that is listed in blue here. Moving on to our WD SN850 SSD now then, which is PCI Express 4, a little cooler running and a little slower than the Crucial PCI Express 5 SSD. We've got fewer results in this graph because I'm not testing some of the PCI Express 5 options, such as the ASRock and the optional Asus heatsink, plus a few other things, but we've still got most of the heatsinks listed in this test. So again, the best result from the Corsair XM2 water block, stunningly low temperature there of just 41 degrees C under load, followed quickly by the Icy Box heatsink, the fan-assisted heatsink at full speed, with that rising 4 degrees C at half speed, so half speed is a no-brainer there. The Sabrent Rocket as well, doing pretty well here, actually beating the half-speed fan-assisted Icy Box as well, or actually matching it. And then we've got the Thermalright HR-09 Pro, which was the very, very large heatsink. And then next up, we've got the Asus standard PCI Express 5 slot heatsink. So it's a modest size heatsink with a small heat pipe going through. So probably one of the better heatsinks out there on motherboard. Then a bit of a leap up to the J&D or the CALIDAKA ARGB heatsink, and that did a pretty good job. I like the RGB lighting on this one, and it was certainly a lot better than the Johnsbo heatsink at the bottom of the graph. So if I was going to go for an RGB enabled one, then that is probably the one that I would go for. Pretty cheap, and did a reasonable job of cooling as well. The Thermalright D6-Y, pretty good looking, very, very cheap. Again, 65 degrees C is probably what you'd expect from a motherboard heatsink, if I'm honest. So questionable given its lack of RGB lighting as to why you might go with that one. Again, super cheap is the Quivinsry or the MHQJRH, depending on where you are in the world. It's listed as one of those things. And 71 degrees C, again, not great. And your motherboard heatsink is probably going to perform just as well or better than that, so questionable purchase. Finally is the Johnsbo ARGB heatsink, pretty poor showing there. You do get RGB lighting for a budget price, but the cooling isn't great. So what do we make of those findings then? Well, first and foremost, if you are in the market for a PCI Express 5 SSD and you're considering the Crucial T700 Pro, don't go for the one with the heatsink because it's not up to the job of dealing with sustained workloads with this super fast SSD. And the temperatures that I saw, even in my rig with a fair amount of airflow going over the motherboard and the heatsink, it still wasn't enough to keep it away from throttling temperatures. So if you are going to go for this SSD, definitely get it without a heatsink and either use your motherboard's own heatsinks or opt for one of the heatsinks that we're going to talk about now. So I should add that all the heatsinks here today you can see buy links to them in the description below. So if you want to buy them right now, you've found the one for you, then click on the link in the description below to take you to that heatsink and a place that you can actually buy it. And you can see links to all the hardware that I've used in today's video as well. So moving on to the PCI Express 5 heatsinks, basically what these are the ones that passed the thermal tests. All the other ones didn't really cut the mustard there. So first and foremost is the Icy Box M.2 fan-assisted heatsink. This thing is awesome value for money, very easy to install, simple to adjust depending on whether you've got a double-sided or single-sided heatsink. It is fan-assisted. It does have a little tiny fan in there, which I know many people probably recoil at, but it is PWM controlled, and you don't need to run it flat out to deal with sustained workloads. In fact, you could even create your own fan curve profile in your motherboard EFI and just have it ramp up when it needs to. But really, you're getting awesome temperatures that are well away from this SSD's thermal throttling zone, even at half speed, which is what I ran some of the tests at. So very good heatsink there from Icy Box, and you can see a link to buy it in the description below. Of course, there wasn't going to be anything that was going to beat full-on liquid cooling, and the winner today in terms of the best temperatures is the Corsair XM2. I've used it in a few builds now. It's relatively easy to install, but you need to watch the pressure when you're compressing it. I think Corsair really needs to take another look at this water block and try and work out a better way of installing the heatsink to your SSD. Use something like the mechanism that the Thermalright used, or the Icy Box, just with screws in the side. You put everything together, very easy. As it is, once you get it on, the results speak for themselves. Absolutely fantastic cooling, and you're not going to see anything better short of another M.2 water block, basically. So slightly expensive at 40 bucks, and of course you will need a custom liquid cooling loop to actually install it. Don't bother buying all your liquid cooling hardware just to get one of these. One of the other options here is going to be a much more better value option rather than kitting out your PC with a custom liquid cooling system just to run this thing. And you will need a custom liquid loop. Don't try running it on its own. You will not see the same results because it is designed to have water flowing through it. So the final option that you can actually buy is the Thermalright HR-09 Pro, and this thing at the moment is really good value in the US on Amazon. You can see a link to it in the description below. Very good value. It's like 10 or 15 bucks. Completely passive as well. There are no fans or anything like that. You might want to add in a fan so that you get airflow throwing through the actual heatsink, and that wasn't the case in my test rig because it's got a heatsink that kind of sits, or the fins on it kind of sit north to south in your case, or top to bottom, shall I say, and that's not the way that most cases go. It's not the way that my case goes. It has front to back cooling. So other than that though, it's still managed to do a really decent job in terms of cooling our SSD, and it's very affordable at the moment, super easy to install as well. The other option we have to consider is the ASRock Blazing M.2 heatsink, which we did test today, but despite ASRock sending me some nearly a year ago now with their original socket AM5 motherboards, and announcing again in March, and I think these things were again available to view at the recent Computex trade show, there's still no sign of them. They're meant to cost around 20 or 30 bucks. If you do find them and they cost that much, they are definitely worth looking at, but they are only compatible, as far as I know, with ASRock motherboards. So that's a bit of a downer. It's a shame that they don't produce a like a universal one that could be mounted in the same way that these other ones do, but we'll have to wait and see. So kind of a tentative recommendation there because you can't buy it and it's only compatible with a specific brand of motherboards. So moving over to the other side now, because none of the other SSDs could really handle the PCI Express 5 SSD that we were looking at today, apart from obviously the Asus motherboard heatsinks. Quite surprised there that they handled the Crucial T700 Pro, but they did, both the small one at the top of the motherboard and the one down below. So well done, Asus, for making a decent motherboard with decent M.2 cooling for super fast SSDs. So the first one I wanted to mention was the Sabrent Rocket. So if you've got a PCI Express 4 SSD, this one's worth considering, but only if you don't have any of the tool-free mountings around the M.2 slot. If it's just an open M.2 slot with no tool-free paraphernalia, this is worth considering. It's reasonably priced, but its large size means that it's likely to foul a lot of those tool-free components like they did on my Asus board. I had to kind of wedge it in and just hold it there with like a big kind of metal block to the side of it just to kind of hold it in place, which isn't ideal. So that's a bit of a downside in that it's not quite as flexible as some of the other heatsinks. Now, you can, of course, opt for any of the heatsinks here with your PCI Express 4 SSD. Any of these ones will work just fine, but my favorite is probably the Be Quiet MC1 Pro. This thing is super cheap, costs around 10 bucks, very easy to install. It's adjustable, so it caters for both double-sided and single-sided M.2 SSDs, which is great, and offered pretty decent cooling results as well. Not able to handle the Crucial T700 Pro, but something like a WD SN850, it's more than capable of cooling. So that was my pick. Also worthy of mentioning are the J&D Tech RGB heatsink, called something else in the US, but if you're going to buy it or you want to check it out, check out the link in the description below because I've got the link to the right model for you down there if you're in the US. And also the smaller Thermalright heatsink as well. Again, pretty good value. It's around 10-15 bucks or something like that. And very easy to install again and offered reasonable cooling. So top marks though go to the Be Quiet, and over on this side, any of these three heatsinks, and I'll put links to all of this stuff in the description below. So that's it for our testing and conclusions today, and I wanted to say thank you to Crucial for sending over the different versions of the T700 Pro. Thanks to Asus for sending over its fabulous ROG Strix X670E gaming Wi-Fi motherboard. Don't forget to like and comment on this video. Love hearing what you guys think of these videos, and are you considering buying any of these SSD heatsinks or maybe a brand new PCI Express 5 SSD? Love hearing what you guys are up to. And also don't forget, lastly, to subscribe to my channel. It's a small ask, but it means a lot to me to have your support and just means that I can continue making videos like this one and helping you guys out with your hardware choices and actually buying stuff that isn't just recommended off the bat because of how it looks. I actually test stuff and give you real world data so you can make informed choices that are gonna basically end up with you getting the best products that you can for your cash. So that's it from me today. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you soon.